welcome to this morning's chat, brought to you by the Center for Global Justice. I'm Cliff DuRand, and Chris Kellogg is here with me this morning. We're going to be talking about what happened to the pink tide in Latin America. After the dictatorships of the 60s and 70s, there was and the depression, or the lack of any growth in Latin America in the 80s, the countries of Latin America, by and large, adopted neoliberal economic policies at the urging, well, even stronger words might be applied, the insistence and the coercion from the International Monetary Fund that required them to have structural adjustment programs. The debt crisis of Latin America in the 80s made most countries vulnerable to IMF insistences. But by the time we get to the end of the 90s, the promise of neoliberalism had proven to be unsupported. The promise had been, well, you privatize, you cut back on social programs, you reduce your government budget, you open the country to free trade, and that the economy will prosper, and a rising tide will lift all boats. Well, by the time that experiment in neoliberalism had had a good run of a decade or so, it was clear that none of that was materializing. The economies were not growing. The inequality in the society was widening. The suffering of those at the bottom of society in particular was increased as a result of the removal of social supports. And so social movements developed in the 90s looking for an alternative to neoliberalism. And that gave rise to electoral victories in a number of countries of progressive candidates. In Venezuela, Hugo Chavez in 1999 was elected as president. Correo in Ecuador, Kirchners in Argentina, Lula in Brazil, Evo Morales in Bolivia. And they constituted what came to be called a pink tide, a kind of, not a red tide, it was a pink tide. With the exception of Venezuela, the other countries were not embarking upon trying to build socialism, but rather more progressive policies that would favor those at the bottom of society, would address some of the social problems, though without structural changes. But we'll talk about that more as we go along. But we want to look at where that promise that gave so much optimism to people on the left, especially in the first half of the first decade, where that is now. What has happened to that pink tide? It seems to have receded, and what we want to address today is what it was that it was trying to do, why it didn't succeed more than it did, and why does it seem to be in decline now. a decline that, of course, is welcomed by the political leadership in the United States and the mass media, and probably exaggerated also. Well, Chris is going to be talking about the case of Brazil. I'll be looking more at Venezuela and Cuba. Chris spends a part of each year in Brazil and watches the developments there closely. In fact, right now, especially closely, with the impeachment of Rousseff that is now going on. So let me turn the floor over to Chris Kellogg.
Okay, I was sent to Brazil thinking, well, I didn't think that they spoke Spanish, but I spoke Spanish when I went in to apply for the Peace Corps, and they said, well, do you want to go to Latin America? I said, oh yeah, it's sort of like Briar Rabbit, I thought I'd just land in the thorns and be good. But of course, they speak Portuguese there, so that's how I learned Portuguese, and I've been going back, I don't know, every year, every other year. But a lot of people outside of Latin America don't even realize that the Brazilians actually do speak some other language than Spanish. And just briefly, that's because even before Brazil was discovered, Spain and Portugal worked out a deal with the Pope, which drew a line through area they had no idea what was there, which in fact ran through nearly the center of the South American continent. So that's why Brazil is separate from the Spanish speaking countries. And then of course the other thing is that Portuguese culture and therefore Brazilian culture is a bit different than Spanish culture in that after Spain withdrew from Latin America, a lot of these areas that were joined under Spanish control became multiple different nations, witness South America and Central America. But for some reason, the Portuguese culture said, well, no, we'll just hang together. We're all Portuguese speakers. And besides a small war with Argentina, which created Uruguay, which is like Belgium in Europe, which is a buffer state where, to keep two warring parties apart, you create this state right in between. That's how Uruguay came about. But I spent a lot of time in Austin, Texas, and we had a lot of presentations on Brazil every year. In fact, we had a week of Brazil culture. And one of the incredible things about Brazil, maybe because it's close to Africa, and the fact that the Portuguese controlled the part of Africa that's right across from Brazil, 4.9 million African slaves were brought to Brazil in comparison to 389,000 to the U.S., 200,000 to Mexico, and 400,000 to Cuba. So, but moving on, there was no actual violent independence war. During Napoleon's invasion of Spain and Portugal is when a lot of countries in Latin America started to get, or have wars of independence. In the case of Brazil, the royalty left Portugal to stay in Brazil, and then the reigning prince didn't want to go back. So they made Brazil a separate empire from Portugal. And basically, most of the history of Brazil has not seen a civil war, etc. And but Brazil did actually, along with Cuba, wait quite late to free the slaves in the 1880s. And when slavery is overthrown, there's this big labor distribution situation that comes about. And so Brazil did what Cuba did as well, which some people call a whitening, in which they tried to get white Europeans to come over because, in fact, like Virginia in the 13 colonies, there were actually more slaves than free people. And so the Europeans have come over since before the turn of the century. Some of the same immigrants that came to the U.S., the Italians, the Jews, and the Eastern Europeans. And they've shaped the country quite well. During the period of Mussolini and Hitler, two dictators came about in South America, in some ways emulating the two. One in Argentina, whose name was Perón, and then there was one in Brazil named Vargas, and those fellows eventually were overthrown or voted out. And then the U.S. enters the picture more than selling Model Ts or whatever they used to do. Following Kennedy and Johnson's creation of the Green Berets and the Special Forces, there was another one I've forgotten. They developed these programs because they thought Latin America was going to be taken over by the communists. So they had these nice things like the Peace Corps, but they also had these unnice things like Special Forces people training people, which they're doing again. Apparently they have a $13 billion budget to train people in Latin America for this coming year. And they trained generals. And so Brazil had an overthrow by the generals 10 years and 15 years before Argentina and Chile. And in fact, LBJ had an aircraft carrier and several destroyers off Rio de Janeiro in case the generals didn't pull it off. He was going to, I guess, bombard Rio or something. It's really amazing. Anyway, that government held on for 21 years. And in '85, the military allowed sort of their picked Senate and House of Representatives equivalent to pick a president. And then after that, there's been popular elections ever since. In the early 90s, the Workers' Party, or the PT, which stands for Partido Trabalhador, came in to be elected, and that was Lula, whose real name is Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. But Brazilians, I don't know if you've ever watched soccer, but they tend to use their first name like on the back of their uniforms and stuff. So calling your president Lula to them is quite natural. And then Portuguese actually doesn't have some of the same gender association. In other words, a name that ends in A in Spanish is often thought to be a woman's name, but in Portuguese not necessarily. Anyway, Lula had spent 7 years in prison during the military regime, and he never finished high school. He was president of the metal workers union, and he was assisted by a woman whose name comes up later, Dilma Rousseff, who has a PhD in economics, and they worked out this situation where they used neoliberal influence, or they partied up with neoliberal people, because Brazil, has gone over 200 million people. So people like Ford and Chrysler and Chevrolet and Renault and Citroën and Fiat all want to sell cars, because Europeans and Americans, they all got so many cars, they have to, junk them every few years. But if you have a market where no one, or very few people have cars, and then suddenly they buy cars, it's a big shot in the arm for companies, including Volkswagen. So there were various programs that were started by the Workers' Party. One was, the most emulated is called Bolsa Familia, which was if you sent your kids to school and you were needy and needing help financially, you got a check from the government or a credit. And also they had a program called Mi Casa Mi Vida, where they made it very easy to buy smaller condominiums. I actually had a small condominium down there for some period of time. So the idea was to get people into home ownership and empower them, and then automobiles. They got the European companies build much smaller cars down there, although some of them are here as well, in Mexico, but smaller than in the U.S. And so many people came into the middle class. And Cliff and I have talked about this before. Some people come to Mexico and they go, oh, look at this big middle class. But in fact, I guess yesterday in Oliver Stone's movie is the fact that, in fact, with neoliberalism, often you do develop a certain amount of more affluent people, a middle class, but at the same time it's often not bringing everybody up. You know, the old idea that a boat doesn't miss, well, a boat with a hole in it doesn't rise or something. But anyway, the idea of the Workers' Party was to try to bring the capitalists within the society and from overseas to help everybody. And a lot of it's through education. I've just been listening to the Brazilian Senate debating whether they're going to impeach the lady president, Dilma Rousseff. And the people that are in favor of her staying in office are saying, well, look at all these programs, look at all the people we've brought up from poverty. And in fact, there's a claim that the Brazilians brought twice the percentage of people out of poverty as the Chavez revolution in Venezuela. But what happened in 2014 was Lula timed out in 2011, so that's when Dilma became president. And Brazil wasn't really affected by the 07-08 American debacle, economic recession, depression, because basically Brazil doesn't trade that much with the United States. It actually competes. I mean, they sell soybeans and corn and chickens, and the U.S. sells those things, and the U.S. subsidizes them. Brazilians tell me they don't think it's totally unsubsidized in Brazil, but like the sugar growers in Brazil sued the United States because, you know, sugar in the United States costs 10 times more than the world market price. But the U.S. hardly ever loses those kind of affairs, or they pay a big fine and then they just keep the subsidies going. But anyway, Brazil really didn't suffer until China started going down, and it coincided with the election for Dilma's second term. Presidents in Brazil go 4-year terms, and they only can have 2, and they have to wait 8 years to try again. And so, you know, in the U.S. they always talk about trying to like get this president or this party through the election before the depression starts again or some recession, so that it doesn't automatically throw it to the other party. Well, what Dilma did, which is fairly common in Brazil, is the states and the federal government own banks. And so she just fudged some money out of the banks into the national budget, and that's what she's actually being impeached for, because Brazil fought really hyperinflation for many years. I was telling Cliff this joke. I worked with a pediatric surgeon who left Brazil when the military took over in '64 because he chose the wrong side. The very most southern state in Brazil actually tried to fight the military takeover in '64. And then, so he flew to New York and finished his medical training in New York City. But he would go back to visit his sister in Rio, and there was a joke that there were 2 guys that rode the bus to work every day, and one's still waiting for the bus, and the other one sees his friend going by in a taxi, and he goes, "Oh, Jose, how can you afford a taxi?" And he said, "By the time I get to work, the price of a taxi will have inflated to the point, you know, so that it's the same as the bus." You know, that, and the various experiences you had, they never put prices on things. They'd put a letter, and then you'd go up and they'd open a book, and oh, today means this much. You know, so, I mean, and it really was a bad feeling for the Brazilians. So when they've had 2 or 3 constitutional rewrites, first one with the military, and what they did is they more or less tried to keep the government from fudging the books like Dilma did, unfortunately. But Dilma is such a likable character. I mean, she was the brains behind Lula. And she, just watching these things, she defended herself 13 hours on Monday, and it was unreal. But the basic problem in Brazil now is that they've lost 10% of their gross national product. The unemployment's gone way up. There's a lot of unsold housing. between Lula and Dilma, they created many universities. States that used to have one federal university now have 5 or 6. Education has very much been stressed. Higher education. I had friends that went to Brazil in the early 60s. There were no PhDs in Brazil in the early 60s. And the last I heard, they turned out more PhDs than the United States a year or two ago. So things have quite changed. Also, the literacy rate was 40% illiterate in the early 60s, and now it's about 18%, which is still high compared to a lot of other countries in Latin America. So that's what's going on, and they're actually going to vote to impeach her at any minute now. I left listening to, they're just going through a certain amount of motions to make it all sound legal. But that's the first part of my talk. I did want to talk about the pink tide, and there was this amazing article which I handed out, which some of you have already seen, about the pink tide and how, this is from a Canadian socialist from Toronto, whose name is Kyla Sankey. And it's interesting because it's from a very socialist angle, which we don't often hear, at least not in the United States. But her idea is that, in fact, the pink tide strategy, economic strategy, was based on neo-developmentalist modeling, which is that they were dependent on extractionism. In fact, you know, the selling of many food crops and minerals to China. So along in 2014, the Chinese economy crashed, the oil prices went down, and another thing is the U.S. government actually changed the discount rate, the Federal Reserve changed the discount rate, and almost all the currencies in the world dropped 20 to 30% in relation to the dollar, which is exactly what happened in Brazil and Canada, Australia. And so what this paper is saying is that in Brazil, the Workers' Party absorbed a lot of the sort of the thinkers and doers from the left-wing social forces into the government, and therefore they couldn't be activists anymore. They were in the middle, you know, they were the establishment, and what's happened now is conservatives sort of had a bad rep because they were associated with the military government. So there was a lot of room for leftist governments after the military government went down. And well, anyway, so moving more to now, in the last couple of years, in fact, in the city that I most often stay in Brazil, in Curitiba, which is known for new urbanism, the idea of putting shops below apartments and not building shopping centers out on the edge of town. They put the shopping malls in the city. But that's also the home of Petrobras, which is the Brazilian equivalent of Pemex. And what was happening with Pemex, and including atomic energy projects and then projects overseas, because between Lula and Dilma, they were supporting Cuba, and they built a state-of-the-art container port in Mariel, which is, 60 kilometers east, and maybe not that much of Havana, hoping to make Cuba like a transshipment place, because, you know, it's near the Panama Canal and it's closer to Europe maybe than the Panama Canal. One of the problems is the U.S., because of the blockade, no ship that goes to Cuba can actually land in the United States for 6 months. The Brazilians also sort of renovated the airport in Havana. But also, 10,000 doctors came to Brazil, similar to Venezuela. And when I go to Brazil, I mostly do Buddhist retreats, and Buddhist retreats are either poor graduate students or professionals very often. And the professional class very quickly has gone to the right. To them, particularly the dentists and doctors I know, they immediately were upset about these Cuban doctors. The Brazilian government was paying approximately, well, the exchange rate has changed, but at the time it was around $2,000 a month for these Cuban doctors. But in fact, when Cuban doctors go overseas, they don't get the full pay the government pays. In the case of Venezuela, it was the swap for oil. So the doctors in Brazil originally were making about the equivalent of $400, and then they pushed that up. But in my personal experience was that actually they filled a hole in communities where there were no doctors. Many of the people had never seen doctors. And it's the equivalent of 20% of the need of the doctors in Brazil filled by Cubans, these 10,000 Cubans. And in a village where some friends have a country home, and also the wife's family still lives, a Cuban doctor came to work there. And it's just amazing. And my friend said, you know, my mom went to see this Cuban doctor, and the Cuban doctor called me to tell me about Mom, you know. And she said, no Brazilian doctors ever called me that. So I recalled, you know, about such things. So it's, you know, it's really, I think there's something knocking. No. Anyway, but with what's happened is that the vice president under Dilma is now the president, acting president, and he's just waiting to get the word that she's impeached so he can go to that conference in China. What is it, the G20 or something that they're having starting this week? And Dilma ran with him on the idea that it's something that Lula did as well, which was to try and placate the capitalist class, in many cases the professional class. And that worked up to 2014. But then, when things started going south economically, they just jumped ship, and this is the result here 2 years later. So now, Brazil and a lot of Latin America have a constitution and a president, just like the United States. They follow the U.S. model. And yet, you know, in Canada or, you know, a lot of countries, they have parliaments. And if the people tell their representatives that they don't think that the prime minister, which is the equivalent of the president, is doing right by the economy, they just have an election and throw the bum out. But in a presidential situation, Dilma's 2 years through her second four-year term. So they've already impeached the president back in the 90s, a guy named Collor, because of corruption charges. And he got what Dilma's going to get, is they tell him they can't take part in politics for 8 years. And the corrupt president is now back in the Congress. You know, in fact, they raided he and his son's home, and they drove out a Ferrari, a Lamborghini, you know, all kinds of very fancy cars that no one knows how they can afford. And he's under investigation. The vice president, Michel Temer, that took over as president, they have immunity when they're in the legislature, or you know, vice president. But when he leaves, he also has already been sentenced to not being able to run for office for 8 years. But he's actually going to be president until Dilma's term runs out in 2 years. But anyway, so the economic situation has caused many people to desert the idea that we can help all the people somehow through neoliberalism, which is what our Canadian socialist friend talks about, is that in fact the pink tide was a form of left neoliberalism. And what happens when the economic situation goes downhill is that there's no mechanisms in place that are going to still help the poor people and still support education and some of the other pushes that the normal socialist state situation would push.
Okay, thank you, Chris. I'd like to kind of follow up on some of those points. I highly recommend the article that Chris referred to. We will post it on our website along with the video of this. What Happened to the Pink Tide, the title of the article. We selected the title for this program before we saw the article, so obviously we're right on the mark with that. The peak of the pink tide is probably in the year 2005. That was when the countries of Latin America, virtually unanimously, rejected the Bush administration's proposal for a free trade area of the Americas. The idea was to take the NAFTA model and apply it to the entire hemisphere. There was a meeting of the presidents of the hemisphere in Argentina in 2005, where Bush had hoped he would get the consent of the governments of Latin America to that idea. Well, they didn't. In fact, they overwhelmingly rejected the idea of a free trade area of the Americas. Now, that was a result of the social movement's success in putting progressive governments in, progressive governments that were breaking from neoliberalism. And the easiest way to break from neoliberalism was in the area of foreign policy and trade policy, because that had the Yankee hand in it. And so the anti-Yankee sentiment, which is strong in Latin America, could be mobilized for public support to reject free trade agreements. But as Chris pointed out, drawing from this article, in the case of Brazil, it was also the case in so many of the other pink tide countries. Their programs did not seek to bring about structural change in the society, structural change in the economy that would change the power relations. What they did domestically, by and large, was promote social programs to benefit those at the bottom of society. They would benefit the poor, but they did not deal with the structural causes of poverty and of the inequality that existed. That is, they continue, with the exception of Venezuela, I'll talk about as a separate case, the other pink tide countries basically tried to work with their national bourgeoisies, with the capitalist class. Kind of neo-developmentalism, it was called, where an effort was made to encourage domestic capitalists to invest and to develop production as an alternative to the importation of goods. This was in line with the strategy that much of Latin America had followed earlier, import substitution. Instead of importing consumer goods, you produce them domestically. In other words, the effort was to try to foster the development of a domestic capitalist economy. Well, to help us in looking at what happened and the outcome, I've put together some charts that offer a model. Let me start with a model of the kind of capitalism that had been promoted in Latin America, neoliberal capitalism. That is, a capitalism in which the state withdraws from the economy, privatizes whatever state enterprises there had been, curtails social programs to the people, and undertakes to regulate the economy through its influence on policies affecting the owners of the means of production, the capitalist class. Well, that leaves the economy still in the hands of the capitalists. And with that comes the power that enables them basically to see that the state follows the interests of that class. Well, now, what the pink tide countries sought to do, in addition to providing benefits to civil society, was to also regulate capitalism. While supporting capitalism, they sought to regulate it, to curtail its abuses, to curtail the predatory capitalism that had emerged. That still left the economy in the hands of the capitalist class. But basically, the pink tide states were responding to popular pressure from civil society. The power in civil society lies in what is called associational power. That is, their power lies in the fact that they can form associations, organizations, lobby the state, but also carry out demonstrations and protests to push the state to more effectively represent their interests and curtail the power of capital over the economy. Now, this was what is called the social democracy model, which in the case of the U.S. was followed during the Roosevelt years with the New Deal. And it's something like that model, then, that the pink tide countries of Latin America sought to institute. Yeah, a question or comment?
I was just wondering, I'm wondering if the associational power of the working class exercises its power primarily through casting doubt on the legitimacy of the system, because lobbying and that sort of thing, as conducted by corporations and so on, works by buying the influence of the political class, the political groups, and that sort of thing. Until the working class threatens to take over by force, I would think that anything that casts doubt on the legitimacy of the system would be a greater threat, perhaps.
Well, the associational power of civil society can be exercised in a number of ways, some of which do not cast doubt on the legitimacy of the system, but seeks to work within the system. I mean, consider trade unions, for example, whose primary thrust is in trying to win the right to organize, the right to strike, the right to bargain for better wages and benefits. All of those can operate within. In fact, they suppose the continued existence of a capitalist class that owns the factories and the like, right? So it's not necessarily oppositional to the capitalist system. Oftentimes, that associational power is simply an effort to carve out more space for the interests of the working class and the popular classes within the existing system. In more revolutionary moments, however, it can go farther than that. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But what has happened in the pink tide countries, by and large, is that though the state undertook to regulate and control the capitalist class, the fact that it still had power over the economy meant that it ended up being in a position to control the state more and more. This is a phenomenon that we've seen in the United States with what is called regulatory capture. That is, federal agencies that were set up under the New Deal and since to regulate capital end up being captured by those industries that they're supposed to regulate. And the agencies end up promoting policies that protect and even advance the interests of the private owners of those industries. Well, that's in effect what happened in the pink tide states. The state, even with neo-developmentalism, had to adopt policies that favored capitalists, whether it was Evo Morales building a road through the indigenous areas of the Amazon, which was vehemently opposed by the people there, thereby weakening, cutting their support for the state, or whether it's Correa in Ecuador, who opened up national parks to oil exploration against the opposition, again, of indigenous peoples, who had supported the election of Correa to the presidency. What you see is this, a state that tries to play ball with the capitalist class ends up having to compromise the interests of those popular sectors that had supported them, thereby weakening that support, and it leaves an opening then for the right. An opening that the right has taken in Brazil, in Ecuador, Bolivia, country after country. Well, the alternative to that now let me come back to this. Is another model of neo-colonial capitalism. What you have is the national bourgeoisie in a position to control the policies of the state because of the power they have over the economy, with little in the way of meaningful power being exercised from civil society to guide the state in a different direction. But this is where there used to be a national border separating the country from foreign interests, the transnational corporations and imperial power. But under neoliberalism, that border is erased for capital. For people, they can't move. They can't migrate so easily, but capital can move around the globe. And so you get a situation where transnational corporations enter into the domestic economy in competition with the national bourgeoisie. Also, they're in a position to influence the policies of the national state, who are interested in development. The state is interested in development, and development requires foreign investment, and so policies are adopted that favor those foreign investors. And add to that the imperial power, whether that be the imperial power of the US or of the IMF or investor-state settlement procedures. You have various forms that imperial power takes, acting upon the state. And of course, that imperial power very much guided by the interests of the transnational corporations. Well, I offer that as a model that is very useful for understanding the limits of what is possible in the neo-colonial capitalist countries of Latin America or elsewhere in the globe. Well, what's the alternative to that? Let me go back to this chart. In the case of Venezuela, Hugo Chavez sought to turn Venezuela in the direction of building socialism, or the beginnings of the building of socialism. Chavez came to power as a result of an election. I mean, unlike the revolutionary leader in Cuba, Fidel Castro, who came to power as a result of an armed insurrection and was able to sweep away the state that had existed previously and the capitalist class that had supported that state of Batista left from Miami. And so in a sense, the Cuban Revolution had a relatively clean slate to build something new and different. Chavez did not come to power that way. He came to power by electoral means. That is, came in as head of a state that was still a state that had been designed to support the capitalist class in an economy that was overwhelmingly capitalist, and to this day is overwhelmingly capitalist. What is it, 90-some% of the economy is in the hands of capitalists. And the media is in the hands of capitalists, who are hostile to what Chavez sought to do, responding to popular pressure from the base in society to try to build the beginnings of a socialist alternative. And that has been done in two ways. One, through the promotion of cooperatives in civil society, which means then that civil society is able to have a direct effect in the economy. So the economy is no longer just controlled by the interests of capitalists, but also by the interests of worker owners of these cooperatives. It's an effort to build an alternative parallel economy, or at least the beginnings of that. That's a very difficult situation to be in. To have two kinds of economic systems existing side by side, with the hope of this one growing and eventually eclipsing this one. Very difficult to do, especially when you take into account what we were just saying about the imperial power from abroad that is supporting this group. And we've seen that support reflected in the U.S. government's quite lavish support of oppositional forces within Venezuela. The other thing that Hugo Chávez's 21st century socialism seeks to do, has sought to do, is to develop communal councils within civil society. That is, the social programs that the state supports, rather than all being filtered through local government officials that are part of the old state that favors capitalism. A good part of that government support goes directly to councils formed among the residents of a community. A couple hundred families form a council, and they then have government funds to use as they see fit, whether it's to build a road, a school, a soccer field, promote a local business or whatever. And the vision has been, and this is a vision that is discussed in an excellent article by Dario Assolini in our forthcoming book, Moving Beyond Capitalism, if I put in a plug for that. These communal councils are envisioned as being the building blocks for a new, different kind of state, an alternative state to the still existing bourgeois state. So what you get developing is a situation of dual power, where the state is divided, partially as a bourgeois state supporting capitalists, and partly as a popular state supporting civil society, and where the power of the economy, or power over the economy, is also divided between the capitalists and a growing group of cooperatives. Well, that's the general plan or vision that Hugo Chavez set out in a situation where you try to begin to build a socialist alternative within the context of a still capitalist society. Now, even under ideal conditions, that's not an easy feat to accomplish, to handle that contradiction. It was made all the more difficult in the case of Venezuela by, well, at least two major factors. One is, as I referred to it, the support by the U.S. for the elements of civil society that are wedded to capitalism, and they have been intransigent. They carried out a coup back in, what was that, 2002 or something, where they seized control of the government, arrested Hugo Chavez, and held him for a couple of days. But then the military, and Chavez had come out of the military, he had friends there, he had been a paratrooper. The paratroopers came and rescued him. And at the same time, the popular classes were in the streets protesting, exercising their associational power against the coup. And as a result, that coup failed. It had been supported and welcomed by the U.S. government and by the New York Times, but it failed, and Chavez came back to power and was radicalized by that. That's when he said, okay, we need to really seriously begin to develop a socialist alternative and the powers within civil society that would represent. Okay, so Chavez faced, what was it, 13 different elections in the years that he was president up until his death. he was elected over and over, again and again. There was even a recall referendum that the opposition had put through, and he defeated that. He was clearly the popular choice of the mass of Venezuelan society. But the U.S., in spite of its claims to be a champion of democracy, saw Chavez as, well, last year, President Obama signed an executive order declaring the Chavez government of Venezuela a threat to national security of the United States and U.S. foreign policy interests. Most of Latin America laughed at that. Ridiculous. But just last March, President Obama renewed that declaration. Well, so the U.S. state, as we saw, exercising power to try to turn the state in a direction more favorable to capitalism. Aside from that, or in addition to that, which has made the transition that Chavez sought more difficult, was the collapse of oil prices. Much of the support being given to co-ops, communal councils, much of the support in the form of social programs, health programs, education, housing, etc., used the windfall of profits from petroleum. Half of the government budget comes from oil revenue. more than 90% of the foreign exchange that Venezuela earns comes from the sale of petroleum. And when oil was selling at $100 a barrel, and at one point around $150 a barrel, Venezuela had a lot of money to support these programs. But then the bottom fell out, and the price of oil dropped to $30, recovered some now, what is it, around $50 a barrel? But that has had a major impact on the Venezuelan economy and the ability of the state to carry out its efforts to build 21st century socialism. And so we see the kinds of difficulties that get headlines in the U.S. media about the crisis in Venezuela. And it is a genuine crisis, though probably exaggerated in the U.S. media. I won't go into that in any more detail because there are other factors that enter into it as well, which are discussed very nicely in this article. But basically, what I've tried to say in summary so far is that while the other pink tide countries sought to compromise with capitalism and did not seriously undertake to build a structurally an alternative to capitalism, Venezuela, in its Bolivarian revolution, has sought to do so under conditions that once were favorable, but now are quite unfavorable. Well, let me turn from the pink tide countries to the red tide country of Cuba and see what they're about. The Cuban Revolution, when it came to power in 1959, sought to build an economic and political system that would overcome the evils that the Cuban people had suffered under the neo-colonial capitalism that had existed since the beginning of the 20th century, and sought to achieve independence and national sovereignty from the Yankee monster to the north. In doing that, Cuba obviously came into conflict with the United States, and as early as the Eisenhower administration, in the first year of the Cuban Revolution in power, the Eisenhower administration undertook to develop a plan to overthrow the revolutionary government in Cuba. Regime change. That's not just George Bush or Dick Cheney's invention. That has been U.S. policy for some time with respect to Cuba since 1960. As a result, Cuba, which had been dependent upon the United States, ended up having to find an ally in the Soviet Union. In the Cold War context, there was an alternative area of support. This is a history that we all know well, I'm sure. But that meant that Cuba ended up adopting the Soviet model of socialism, what is called state socialism. That is, in the 20th century, the prevailing view was that socialism meant that a revolutionary state, acting as the instrument of the working class, undertook to own and control the means of production in a way to benefit the interests of that working class. Now, socialism meant state ownership and state planning of the economy. Well, by the mid-1980s, Cuba was recognizing that that had its problems. It was leading to a bureaucratization of the society, a bureaucratization of government. And it began to try to find alternative ways. Then the special period hit in the 90s, that is after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that proved to them that that model really was not sustainable. But as a result of the economic crisis they were in, they went into just kind of a survival mode. And it wasn't until after the turn of the century that Cuba then began to look seriously to a different way of building socialism. There was a famous speech that Fidel gave back in 2005 at the University of Havana, where he said, "Of the many mistakes we have made, the most serious was the mistake in believing that someone knew how to build socialism." No one did, really. There were no blueprints. Without naming it, that was in effect an assertion that the Soviet Union even didn't know how to build socialism, that their model didn't work either. Well, what we have seen now, since then, in recent years, is an effort in Cuba to go in a different direction, to move away from the state socialism that had existed toward a different model that in some ways draws upon the thinking of Hugo Chávez's notion of 21st century socialism. That is one that seeks to build power within civil society. Now the problem in Chávez's model was that you still had a capitalist class there to contend with. In Cuba, they had gotten rid of that, back in the 1960s. And so, but civil society had pretty much withered away under state socialism. I often like to quote a Cuban friend of mine, Olga Fernandez, who observed a number of years ago that what we found was that rather than the state withering away, it was civil society that was withering away. And the lesson of that is that it's necessary to rejuvenate civil society. And that has been a major thrust of the reforms that Cuba has been undertaking the last number of years. 5 years ago, they instituted a program to promote the formation of cooperatives. It had been the state that had controlled the economy under state socialism, but now the state was turning some control over the economy to associated producers in civil society through the formation of cooperatives who can participate directly in the economy. And in addition, the reforms include a rejuvenation of the mass organizations as a vehicle for the expression of popular interest to guide the revolutionary state. The Cuban state is different from the states of bourgeois societies. In bourgeois societies, the function of the state is to maintain the social order. In Cuba, the function of the state is not to maintain the social order, but a revolutionary project of transforming the social order in a socialist direction. And to make sure that it does go in that direction, you need, a state that is responsive to the popular interests of the people. But at the same time, as part of the reforms, as the state withdrew from the complete control of the economy by yielding some to co-ops, it also opened space for the emergence of small private businesses, the petty bourgeoisie. This was done because it was recognized that the state could not run everything as it had undertaken to do by the end of the 1960s, when all small businesses were taken over by the state in what was called the Revolutionary Offensive of 1968. It undertook it took over restaurants, it took over barber shops and beauty parlors, and took over all private businesses. Well, it's now recognized that the state can't run everything, can't run it well. In some cases it did run things well, in many cases it did not. And so now many of those enterprises are being opened up for private investment, Cuban investment, not foreigners. The wall separating Cuban sovereignty from the global economy is still jealously protected. Now, the emergence of a petty bourgeoisie in Cuba is often pointed to by commentators in the U.S. as the beginning of capitalism. And it could be that if these small businesses were allowed to grow and become big capitalists, a big bourgeoisie, but the revolutionary state undertakes to regulate and to tax them so that there will not be an accumulation of wealth in private hands. That's different from the situation that we saw in the others, where that accumulation of wealth is possible. The reforms in Cuba, while allowing space for the petty bourgeoisie to emerge, undertakes to limit and control it so it does not become the breeding grounds for a new capitalist class. The U.S. would very much like to see it move in that direction, and one of the major thrusts of Obama's opening to Cuba is to encourage the development of this petty bourgeoisie, for it to grow and prosper. And that's one of the challenges that the revolutionary government of Cuba faces now, how to contain that while still harnessing the vitality that the petty bourgeoisie contributes to the Cuban economy. Well, that's basically the situation that exists in Cuba now, where elements of the Bolivarian revolution, Hugo Chavez, represented by using the state to empower civil society, building a new kind of socialism, is incorporated into a system to overcome the ossification that occurred under state socialism, but at the same time overcoming that ossification by opening up space for small private businesses. So that's the situation that exists in Cuba now, and it contains contradictions, just as the Venezuelan effort contained contradictions. But hopefully they will not be fatal. So let me end there. I've gone on for longer than I had expected, but I'm sure you have comments and questions, either to what I've said or what Chris has said. Yeah, Chuck.
Yeah, I agree virtually with everything you've been saying about the economics of the past and mistakes and successes that we've had. My difference is the way I view fundamental human behavior and the use of terminology. For example, in that square box of the economy, no matter what system you design, whether it's socialism or capitalism or whatever, the people in that box are the most influential and powerful people of the group, whatever that group is. And as time goes on, and as they get more power in that group, wherever they come from, let's say your cooperatives get very powerful, they tend to look out for their own interests as opposed to the interests of other people. And to me, it's all a matter of leadership. It's the values of the leaders in that square box that are going to determine what happens. And I think one of the great things about the United States when it created the greatest middle class in history is that the people in that box said that we're going to keep the capitalists from making so much money. We're going to raise income taxes to 90%, inheritance taxes to 80%, and we're going to make sure that we design programs to benefit the civil society with minimum wages and things like that. And we're going to make these laws federal so that Louisiana is limited in its ability to compete with Massachusetts in offering the worst labor conditions. And so, in other words, in that square box, we had people who were committed to balancing the interests of these people versus these people. And there's no world government that will do that. And that's one reason why I'm, to some extent, kind of an isolationist. I think the United States has lost its ability to protect its workers. And let's see, what else? To me, it seems like you've got, drawing from Thomas Piketty's book on capital, he says, income from capital tends to continue and accelerate from generation to generation. In other words, the people who have it get more, and they want to get more. Oh, well, the income from work ends when work stops. It doesn't go to the next generation. And somehow or another, you've got to balance the interest of the people who are contributing, making businesses, establishing co-ops, doing whatever they're doing, and the people who are down at the bottom. And to me, it's leadership. And I think the truest statement, you said nobody knows exactly how to create the perfect social system. And you said everything's got to be flexible, and to me, that's the answer. You've got to realize when one group is getting too much benefits at the expense of other groups. So again, everything that you've been mentioning, I'm right in tune with, as you know from the things I've been writing. But it's just how you define it. Like you call it neoliberalism, I would call it classic conservatism. And I don't know how they took over our term, but it doesn't sound like liberal at all to me. But I guess that's the way the term is used today.
Mm-hmm. Well, you made several points. Let me comment on all three of them. Let me start with that last point about the terminology. The term neoliberalism refers not to the social liberalism that we know in the U.S. from the New Deal, from the Roosevelt years, but rather it refers to 19th century liberalism. The liberalism of 19th century, laissez-faire government, free trade, etc. And that ideology was in eclipse, at least since its collapse in the Great Depression. And that collapse gave rise then to the social liberalism that we associate with the use of the term liberal today. It was in the 70s that 19th century ideology was resurrected and came back, brought back by Margaret Thatcher in Britain and Ronald Reagan in the U.S. And they called it neoliberalism. It is that 19th century liberalism renewed for the 20th century context. Second point that you made about, well, how about co-ops, human nature, won't co-ops grow and become like collective capitalists, as they're sometimes called. There certainly is that possibility. But in the Cuban context, at least, the co-ops that are being formed are forming within the context of a socialist culture where there is the widespread belief that there is a responsibility to promote a common good rather than only one's self-interest. And that ideological orientation is in the media, in the chartering of co-ops and everything is being promoted. And the co-ops, it's made very clear, have a social responsibility. Not just the responsibility to be a successful business, but they have a responsibility to the neighborhood in which they operate, for example. Give you an example of a beauty parlor in Havana that became a cooperative and is a successful business, as I understand it. But one of the things they do is they provide their services free of charge to the elderly. You know, that's how they are fulfilling a social responsibility to the larger community. So it's not inevitable that cooperatives become collective capitalists. Again, you're right, it depends upon leadership, the kinds of ideas, the kinds of ideology that is promoted in the society. Let's see, the third point that you made, what was it? It slipped my mind right now.
I don't remember myself.
Well, maybe we'll come back to it.
Yeah.
Chris, did you want to comment on anything?
Well, you know, the interesting thing in the United States is there is a lot of so-called co-ops, you know, and I was thinking of what you were speaking about. But these co-ops, well, in fact, all credit unions are essentially co-ops. And then in the Midwest, farmers still have co-ops, but some of these co-ops are actually sort of top-heavy as far as the power is concerned. Like in the state of Iowa, there's a big problem now with pollution, I understand in North Carolina or South Carolina as well, with hog farms, which produce, you know, one hog farm can produce as much sewer as a medium or smaller city. And but in that case, you know, the farmers are actually working for larger companies, the feed companies, and then the people that slaughter the hogs for food. And so there's this unholy alliance between the co-ops and the big meat packers, and a lot of it has to do with monopolies that have taken place since Reagan came about. I was wondering one thing I wanted to ask Cliff, because last week we were also discussing Cuba, and it sounded like co-ops are running into a slight bureaucratic speed bump. Mm-hmm. And part of it has to do with the fact that there's a lower taxation on co-ops than these privately owned or whatever businesses. Is that one of the reasons that's...
No, that's one of the things that has fostered the growth of co-ops in Cuba. The fact that they're given preferential treatment by the state, lower tax rates, preferential access to bank loans, and the like. There has been bureaucratic resistance to co-ops, but that's, the bureaucrats who have to, approve the legal documents establishing a cooperative as a legal entity sometimes move very slowly, because if only because they see that as a reduction in their power. I mean, for example, if it is the food industry, the food ministry in charge of restaurants, that now has to give the documents to a co-op that is forming a restaurant, that means those bureaucrats are losing control over entities, and so they're often very slow to approve it. Whereas they're very quick to approve the licensing of small private businesses. So they've grown rapidly. The co-ops have grown slowly. And that's also partially because the co-op law that was adopted in December of 2012 was seen as an experimental initiative. We're going to set up 498 new cooperatives on an experimental basis to see how that goes, and see what adjustments we have to make to avoid problems before we then open the door for widespread cooperativization. And so that's another reason why that's moved slowly. But recall now the third point I wanted to respond to in what Chuck said, about the need for balance, the need to balance interests. Now, if we go back to this model of neoliberal capitalism, which is basically what we have in the United States now. Generally, it is not capitalists who balance their interests. You know, each capitalist is out for their own self-interest. It is the state that has played the role of balancing the interests of capitalists and also of the bulk of society, who are the consumers. Now, the adoption of the neoliberal ideology in public policy in the United States has meant that, well, it's the market that will govern things. Well, and as Piketty points out, the market results in the increasing concentration of wealth among the capitalists, increasing inequality, which has a depressing effect on the ability of consumers to buy what is being produced. And so we're seeing a situation where there is not effective demand for all that has been produced, and as a result, capitalists, rather than investing in productive activities, are investing in speculative activities, financial instruments of various sorts, which don't grow the economy in reality at all. And you see this also in policies in the European Union, where the financial crisis that came out of 2008 is being responded to with austerity. Austerity that, to take the extreme case of Greece, is driving Greece increasingly into bankruptcy, into further and further debt, cutting back more and more in the ability of the economy to grow and pay its debt. It's a self-defeating cycle, and there's no political instrument capable of effectively regulating that and balancing the interests of producers and consumers. And so individual capitalists allowed to run wild because the state has disarmed itself, no longer able to balance those interests, but is fundamentally wedded to promoting the interests of capitalism, and thus no longer able to function effectively as a means for advancing the interests of the capitalist class as a whole, which is what the Roosevelt administration did successfully with the New Deal. Okay.
Well, didn't
Yeah.
they advance more than the interests of the capitalist class, the New Deal did,
Yeah.
with all of the social programs
Mm-hmm.
improved, or dramatically improved, a lot of civil society, right? So it wasn't just...
And did that in response to the popular pressure, you know, the social movements of the 1930s, you know, that supported the social programs of the New Deal. But the state also, the New Deal state, you know, regulated the capitalists, the Securities and Exchange Commission, for example, and other such measures in order to try to prevent another collapse of the stock market, adopting Keynesian economic policies.
I had a question at your Cuban chart.
Yeah.
What is, when you refer to the bureaucrats who are limiting the development of the co-ops, the bureaucrats are the employees of the government?
Yeah.
They are paid by the government.
Yeah.
But that is another example of the human nature of power, right? I mean, why, as an employee of the government, why do they care? What is their self-interest that's being protected or threatened as a result of that?
Yeah, well, there's a self-interest in bureaucratic power, but there's also, this is something the Cuban leadership says over and over again. Raul Castro said it many times. There needs to be a change in mentality. A change in the mentality of bureaucrats who need to come to see themselves as more than pencil pushers, but as having a social responsibility. But also a change of mentality in the population at large, who had become accustomed to letting decisions be made up there. What is needed is to develop a self-understanding as being capable of initiating action, or what Hugo Chavez called protagonistic participation, protagonistic democracy.
Well, I've asked you this before, and there's no right answer, but all of these methods of the way human beings handle power and money, whatever the money is in a society, always seem to work well on a small scale. Has there ever been a good example of how growth has led to anything other than dissolution of that good plan? I mean, do we have a historical example of a time? I mean, you could look at the Scandinavian countries that seem to be working really well but now that their society is changing, their government will change, and their view toward improving the lot of its citizens will change because of the nature of its citizens have changed.
Yeah.
What can we look at as a good example?
Yeah, the Scandinavian countries are a good example of social democracies that created many really very good programs that benefited people, but operate within the context of an economy still largely controlled by private ownership of the means of production, by capitalists. And that contradiction creates an unstable situation. Now, social democracy, it may be possible to sustain it for a generation even, or many decades at least, but that contradiction always leaves it precarious. And we're seeing that in the Scandinavian countries, the rollback of those social programs. As we saw in the U.S., the rollback of the New Deal programs.
My feeling as an anthropologist is that, and this is why I think I understand what's going on in Cuba, is there's always this natural impulse for small businessmen to exist. And in fact, before the Industrial Revolution, there was always entrepreneurism. And then with trains and industrialization and improved communication, you have this situation where monopolies or larger industrial entities come about, and they have much more influence over the government than a bunch of small shopkeepers or skilled craftsmen or professionals. And so, some people say we're in the cancer stage of capitalism because basically it's devouring itself. And looking for alternatives is in co-ops, etc., and mixed economies. I visited Yugoslavia a couple times way back when it was still Yugoslavia, instead of Serbia, Slovenia, and all the other countries it broke into. And it actually was using this system of smaller entrepreneurs. I met a family where you could have 5 employees at a restaurant, so each member of the family owned a different restaurant, although I think the father was managing them all. But, there was this idea that you could mix small entrepreneurism with a state-run economy. And of course the co-ops were there as well, but the idea of pushing co-ops, I think, the idea of empowering each individual, and I think in co-ops that there's more potential for less powerful people, to bring around their own lives and things, and of course there's, in the U.S., whoever goes and votes at their credit union election, the guy that oversees the employees, I've never met anybody, but I get a notice, in the mail, it says, oh, we're going to have an election of the whatever they call the elected person of the board. But, I think that when people work and together, now, this co-op in Spain that people, Mondragon, I've always wondered about because it's so large. It's like, it actually has segments of it where they have paid employees that are not members of the co-op. So my feeling is that there is a finite size to co-ops.
Size to everything.
Yeah, but the problem in our world is that the bigger is better thing is still so strong in the push to produce and to grow, which are all parts of capitalism at some point. But at the point that capitalism is at now, it needs to change, or it's just going to fail.
Well, humanity needs to change.
For humanity.
Growing population in a world of decreasing natural resources.
Right.
And climate change, and that's been attributed to one of the biggest problems in Syria right now. It started with a drought in Syria.
Right.
And when people don't have enough food and water and air to breathe, this and that that's breathable, you get all kinds of problems. And mankind is doing too much growing.
And the Scandinavian model, which was based on fairly homogeneous populations of people that, often families have been side by side for generations, or even in the cities, is now changing because of all the disruption in Syria, right? And in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Well, that's what a mess.
Yeah.
We got to be going. We got
I
somebody
know we
coming
do.
to our house to do some work for us. So.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming.
Well, thank you very much.
I'm really glad we did. And that's great. It'll be on the website, so
I was about
plenty
to
of
trade my
people.
hat in for a better one.
Oh.
Yeah.
No, that one's made out of straw. This one's made out of plastic.